Thanks, Alison. The whole photovoltaic area is very different to a lot of industries. You know, we came from a background of electrical engineering, and our whole school of photovoltaics evolved out of electrical engineering. And when you're looking at trends within an area like electrical engineering as a whole, and you're looking at what changes from one year to the next, changes are relatively slow in terms of taking place. In comparison, a heck of a lot can happen in 1 year in photovoltaics. And part of, I guess, the turmoil that exists within photovoltaics is partly because it is a relatively new industry. It's one that's growing very rapidly, fastest growing industry in the world for its size. Technology's changing quickly, things are evolving rapidly. And, you know, we talk about the world financial crisis as having thrown a lot of industries into turmoil. But I don't think you will find any industry that's had to go through as much turmoil as what the photovoltaic industry has gone through. Certainly the world financial crisis and everything that went with that contributed you know, significantly to that turmoil. But I think it's been more than that. I mean, photovoltaics has had to go through this maturing that's taken place in recent years. And part of the turmoil has resulted from government policy around the world. And sometimes that government policy has been quite erratic and changing very rapidly, and it's created an environment where it's been quite challenging for manufacturers in the world, around the world to adapt to very sudden changes in demand, and they've tried to accommodate the necessary changes in supply, but it hasn't always worked out well. And so we've seen some very interesting situations where only, you know, 5 years ago we had demand that was so high it was pushing the price of photovoltaics and all the components that make up photovoltaic modules, pushing the price of those things incredibly high. And just as quickly it went to the absolute other extreme where there was a massive oversupply of all those same components and modules. And of course, you know, supply and demand operates to some extent in this industry, and so when you've got an oversupply you find prices falling very rapidly. And so we've seen an incredible shift in a very short period of time where prices have actually fallen by 80%, which is quite an amazing change to have happened so quickly. And government policy has had a significant role to play in this, particularly in some countries. And it's because photovoltaics has not just grown as an industry with supply and demand being the driving forces alone. Governments around the world have recognised how important this industry is for the world and how important it is for the world's future. Now, energy is one of the key requirements of mankind. In fact, you know, when experts have looked at how to make a measure of quality of life in the world, often they come back to a measure of energy consumption as being the best indicator. And so when you look at the developing countries around the world and you look at their energy consumption per person, you can very closely correlate that energy consumption with their quality of life. And so you get developed countries like Australia and the US who are using 10 times the amount of energy per person compared to the world average. And then you get the developing countries that are per person using 1/10 of that amount of energy. And so around the world, you know, governments have recognised that provision of energy for our growing world and our growing world's need for energy in the future is of critical concern and critical importance. Because, you know, it's even questionable whether fossil fuels can continue to provide the energy levels that our world is using at the moment, let alone in the future when experts have predicted that our world needs 4 times as much energy by the end of this century as what we're currently consuming. And that is simply to provide more or less equality of life throughout the different countries by assuming that, okay, in Australia and the US we'll start to consume a little bit less, but we really don't want to sacrifice quality of life. And so really we have to accept the fact that people in developing countries that are using less than 1/10 of the amount of energy as us, they need to be able to consume more energies, which means in the future we have to be able to provide them with good, clean energy sources. And so photovoltaics has been identified as probably the key industry, the key technology, with help from other renewable energy technologies, but it has been identified by many governments and many studies as being a very likely candidate for a way of providing that energy for the world in the future. And so as a result, it's probably not too surprising that different governments have taken initiatives to try and kickstart this industry, to help it mature more quickly, develop the technology more quickly. And you can do that in a whole range of ways. And, you know, funding research groups like ours here is one way it can be done. But governments have also chosen to provide subsidies and generous feed-in tariffs to encourage people like us as consumers, people with our own houses, to be involved with generating our own electricity from photovoltaics. And some of the schemes that have done that have done so very, very successfully. Some have been an absolute disaster. I mean, we see the situation in Spain where it went from being a tiny market to, in a period of about 12 months, becoming the largest market in the world, because there the government decided to introduce feed-in tariffs that were probably way too generous. Now, they didn't think so at the time, they didn't realise at the time, but the industry just exploded in its growth in response to those feed-in tariffs, because supply and demand took over. Consumers like you and I, living in Spain, all wanted to buy this technology, put it on our rooftops, generate electricity and receive these generous feed-in tariffs as we fed the electricity into the grid. And so the demand grew much faster than the government had expected, so fast, in fact, that it was going to send Spain bankrupt. So they had to do something about that, and they went to the other extreme and basically axed the whole thing. And so the poor manufacturers of the product, they're trying to manage these massive changes in demand. One moment there's huge demand from Spain, which had become the largest market in the world for photovoltaics, to suddenly it's not there. And so they're investing very heavily in trying to expand their productions to provide for these sorts of markets. Suddenly it's not there. And so they have an overcapacity. Then you get the world financial crisis coming in, and that further curbed the demand. And so suddenly we find we've got an oversupply situation. And all of that got made worse by the fact that governments around the world start thinking we have to offer stimulus packages for our local industry. And they wanted to pick which industries were the most important ones for them to support through the financial crisis. And different countries made different decisions. But one of the things that a lot of the Asian countries did, and particularly the Chinese government, is they saw photovoltaics as being a really important industry, not just for China, but for the world. And so things like low interest loans were being made available to the Chinese manufacturers, which had grown to be the biggest in the world. And so that gave those companies the opportunity to keep expanding their production, because they were being encouraged by the Chinese government to stimulate economic growth, to stimulate economic activity. And so the obvious way to do that is to keep expanding your production, employing more people, producing more product. But unfortunately, it was at a time when around the world, the markets weren't ready for it. In fact, the markets were doing the exact opposite. So we got ourselves into this situation, a very, very difficult one, around 2010, 2011, and we're seeing the consequences of it even now. And that is that there was a way oversupply of product. And so that brings us to the present point in time of how is the industry now going in terms of dealing with this turmoil. So prices have fallen 80%. Now there's been a lot of good reasons why the price fell by 80%. I mean, it was going to fall very drastically anyway because of improvements in technology, economies of scale, a whole range of reasons were going to contribute to it. But it's kind of had a bit of an overreaction due to the oversupply that's also taken place. The good news is that now we've kind of bottomed out and demand is picking up very, very nicely in a lot of countries. And it was inevitable that the demand was going to pick up, and I'll explain why that was the case shortly as we move through some of the slides in my presentation. But the good news is most of the cell manufacturers are now actually operating at full capacity, producing more product than they've ever produced before. So the market continues to grow. Maybe there is still oversupply, but the market is growing nicely. Manufacturers are starting to expand their capacity again. This drastic falling in price, we've seen an end to that. Prices have now stabilised. And so a lot of the bankruptcies that we've had in recent years, with quite a few companies around the world becoming bankrupt and having to stop production, we should see an end to that sort of drastic behaviour where companies are being forced into bankruptcy because the prices were just too low. So I believe we're moving into a very, very healthy phase now for the photovoltaic industry, where we're going to see good and sustained growth into the future. We're going to see prices stabilise and in the longer term continue to fall. And I think it's a pretty healthy situation for both consumers and manufacturers at this point in time. So that's just a bit of an introduction on the turmoil that this industry has faced in recent years and where we are at the present point in time. Okay, so photovoltaics. Just in case you're not too familiar with photovoltaics, I think photovoltaics are magic. Right? When I was a little kid and I learned about photovoltaics, you know, I used to go to magic shows and you see all these illusionists do these magic tricks and things like that. I couldn't think of anything that was more magic than a photovoltaic device. Because back then I had no idea how it worked and it didn't seem like it should do what it does do. So, you know, you take this just disc of silicon and you hold it under a light and suddenly that thing is powering my TV set and lights and computers, and basically anything electrical can be powered by solar cells. And here was this device that had no moving parts, no noise, no pollution being produced, no waste products, and it wasn't wearing out. You know, as long as you shine light on it, it will just keep on working. Needs no maintenance and will basically last forever as long as you protect it properly from, you know, the moisture that wants to corrode your metal contacts and things like that. So fundamentally no wear out mechanism for a solar cell. And it all just seemed way too good to be true. And of course it was, because the cost of buying a solar cell when I was interested in them 30, 40 years ago, it was 1,000 times the price it is now. Okay, that shows you how far this industry has come over the last 30 to 40 years. So the price has come down something of the order of 1,000 times. So yes, it was too good to be true, because here was this magic technology that could power anything electrical potentially, but no one could afford to use it because it was too expensive. So that's all changed now. We've seen incredible reductions in price that now make this a technology that is affordable by most people. And this kind of summarises where the industry's at. This is just looking at Germany. And I'm picking Germany because Germany is the, you know, with Spain disappearing as a huge market, Germany has, in a sustained way, been the largest market in the world for many years now. And there's good reasons for that, because they also have had a generous feed-in tariff scheme, but a very sensible one. Unlike Spain, the way that the Germans have implemented theirs has actually been very helpful for the industry. It's encouraged the growth of the industry, it's encouraged investment, it's encouraged technology development, it's encouraged a lot of competition. And so we've seen a great result from that. And this kind of summarises where we're at. So if we go back just to 2007, the actual cost of electricity for householders from photovoltaics back at that time was way too high for people to use without the feed-in tariff. And so feed-in tariffs were introduced to basically enable photovoltaics to compete with fossil fuel generated electricity. And the logic is that if people started to use it, it would create a market, people would therefore manufacture more. As they manufactured more, they would get economies of scale and start bringing down the price. And as they made profits from photovoltaics, which never used to happen back in the 90s, once they started to make profits, they would therefore invest more in the technology development to make their technology better. And that is exactly what has happened. And so you can see here that the blue curve, which is the price consumers pay for their electricity, has just come down and down and down and down and down. And of course, not surprisingly, while that's been happening, the cost of fossil fuel generated electricity, like in most countries, has gone up and up and up. Maybe not quickly, but you can see there's a gentle slope. And going into the future, that slope is going to continue. So fossil fuel generated electricity with time will keep getting more expensive. We're certainly seeing it here in Australia. We have seen massive increases in the cost of our electricity here in Australia in recent years. And so we reached this very critical point in 2011 where photovoltaics was actually able to generate electricity as cheaply as what fossil fuels can do it at a retail level. In other words, if a householder puts photovoltaics on their roof, generates their own electricity, they can do so just as cheaply as if they bought it from the electricity grid generated by fossil fuels. So we call that grid parity. And of course the aim of photovoltaics is not just to equal fossil fuels, but to get cheaper than it so that it actually becomes the obvious choice for everybody. Because there's still challenges about using photovoltaics. You know, this costing here that's shown here, you buy your photovoltaic system up front and then you essentially don't have to pay for your electricity for the next 20 or 30 years. But you have to get that money up front, which for many people means they have to borrow the money. They then have to pay interest on it. That's all part of the real cost of getting your electricity from photovoltaics. So all that has to be costed into it. So it creates an additional challenge for photovoltaics. But we've reached this very interesting situation where not just in Germany, but we're seeing right across most of Europe now, photovoltaics becoming able to generate electricity just as cheaply as fossil fuels, if not more cheaply. So looking at the grid here, the colour scheme, you'll notice that white in the middle here represents grid parity. That's where, without any subsidies whatsoever, photovoltaics can generate the electricity at the same price for households as what the fossil fuels can do so. And you'll notice there's a lot of white areas all around the place. Some white areas even right up here, white area up here. I guess this is Iceland. Maybe it's white for another reason. Okay, so I'm assuming that's not ice, that's grid parity, I'm assuming. Because when you look at these other countries, it's interesting because you start to get to the yellow and orange and brown, and there's a lot of yellow and orange and brown all around a lot of Europe. That's where photovoltaics are actually cheaper. Okay, you're actually generating your electricity more cheaply for your house than what you can get the electricity from fossil fuel generated electricity via the grid. And you can see that a lot of Europe is now in exactly that situation. And as you get down near, closer to the equator, down to the more southernmost parts, you'll notice that the economics are looking better and better, and that's primarily because they get more sunshine. So the more sun you get, the more electricity you generate from your photovoltaic system, so it all works pretty well. And there's relatively few areas now, just a little bit of light blue here, and light blue is still very close to grid parity. Okay, you're not seeing any more of the dark blue anymore, anywhere in this entire area, and in fact in the entire world, you virtually don't see any dark blue. Okay, everywhere is getting now very close to grid parity or even cheaper than grid parity for the photovoltaic generated electricity. So we can extend this to the rest of the world, and there's been studies done. This is one last year done by Applied Materials. That's the world's largest tool manufacturer for this industry. And their study a year ago showed that in many, many countries, more than 100 of major countries around the world, photovoltaics is now the lowest cost for electricity generation in those countries. And so it really is something happening all around the world that photovoltaics now, without subsidy, are economically viable. And the good news isn't just, I guess, the viability of this as a technology and the fact that it's such a good sign for where this technology is going to head in the future, but it's also very important for the stability and turmoil, or getting rid of the turmoil for this industry. Because as you remove your dependence on government subsidies and you remove your dependence on feed-in tariffs having to be generous, then what you do is you get rid of a lot of the instabilities that have created so much turmoil for the manufacturers. You're no longer so vulnerable to government policy. And you know, here in Australia, we can't point our finger at the rest of the world. We've been as bad as anybody. You look at New South Wales government's policy on feed-in tariffs. You know, they jumped from having a 60 cent a kilowatt hour feed-in tariff one day to suddenly having it as 20 cents a kilowatt hour the next day, when there was a change of government, to then basically nothing, right? So New South Wales has created probably as much turmoil for the photovoltaic industry in New South Wales as what any government in the world has done for their industry, okay? The reality was, one government introduced the feed-in tariff here. It was too generous. Everybody knew it was too generous. I have no idea why it was introduced. 60 cents a kilowatt hour was just absolutely ridiculously generous. Yes, I did put a PV system on my roof. I'm not stupid, okay? And lots of other people put PV systems on their roof. But we all knew that it was too generous, and it certainly was not sustainable. So as soon as that government lost the election, the new government came in, looked at it and said, this is ridiculous, we're going to go bankrupt. So it eliminated it all, right? So we have to get rid of this dependence on government policy that can create so much turmoil. And thankfully, reaching grid parity is the best way for this industry to mature and become only vulnerable to the usual sorts of supply and demand criteria that other industries grow and live and survive by. Okay, so not surprisingly, we've had the fastest growing industry in the world. That should continue. And if you look at the growth, 2010 was when the growth peaked. You know, we had 100% growth. Now, 2010 was actually after the world financial crisis. So it was even after all the turmoil had hit. And here's the industry still growing at 100% in 1 year. So it's always a bit dangerous to have an industry growing that fast. But what I want to point out to you isn't just how rapidly it's grown. I also want to draw your attention to the different colours here and the different coloured sections. So the red section, which is obviously totally dominant, if you come back to 2005, there's basically no red. Okay, now the red section represents the manufacturing in China and Taiwan. Okay, relatively small part of the world, but in terms of photovoltaic manufacturing, totally dominant by 2010. And so the Chinese have had a huge role to play in the development and growth of this industry. And the Chinese have actually done an amazing job at helping drive technology development, helping drive efficiencies in manufacturing, helping drive the economies of scale, and helping drive down the price of photovoltaics. So we have a lot to be thankful for. At UNSW, we've had a lot to do with Chinese companies because luckily for us, we've developed some technologies that the Chinese companies have liked. One of the things that the Chinese companies do particularly well, and that is that they look around the world and they identify what they think are the best technologies. And then they do a really good job at commercializing them. And they do that better than anyone else in the world. So when you look at the technologies that have gone into large-scale manufacturing, I don't think any of them have actually been invented and developed in China, and yet they're all being manufactured in China. You know, some come from the US, some come from places like ECN in Europe, some from Japan, some from Australia, all around the world basically. They haven't come from China, but the Chinese companies are what have been so brilliant at identifying the good technologies for commercialization and then getting them into large-scale manufacturing in a very efficient and effective way, and then driving down the price. And of course, then they export their product all around the world. So here in Australia, our market is growing very rapidly. You walk around the street now, you'll see photovoltaic panels on a lot of houses, and that will continue to happen. And you will find that probably more than 90% of those solar panels were made in China. And most of them are very good quality product. Some of them are absolute rubbish, and that's something that we're also going to look at as we move through these slides. Okay, so talking about the role of the Chinese, just to look at how it has evolved. If we go back to 2007, we saw the first Chinese company, which was Suntec, become one of the largest 5 manufacturers in the world. So that was basically the birth of the Chinese photovoltaic industry. It came through Suntec. First large manufacturer, the first manufacturer to basically gain an international reputation for the quality of their product and the performance of their product. And so they were able to develop very substantial export markets. Other companies then followed and did very, very well at setting up their own manufacturing. So we saw companies like JA Solar, another Chinese company, break into the top 5 in 2008. Then in 2009, we saw Yingli, another Chinese company, make it into the top 5 companies. By the time we got to 2011, it's just about all Chinese companies. There's one US company here, First Solar, but the number 1, 2, 4 and 5, all Chinese companies. And that's pretty much the same way it is now. These have just kind of shuffled themselves a bit. Yingli's actually become the largest in the world now. But pretty much Chinese, Taiwanese companies continue to very much dominate photovoltaic manufacturing. Now, an interesting thing that I want to point out is that the photovoltaic modules used to totally dominate the cost of putting in a photovoltaic system, right? Totally dominate. That has all changed to the point where the photovoltaic module, for a lot of rooftop systems now, is only something like 20% of the cost of putting in a photovoltaic system, because the price of the modules has come down 80%. And a lot of the other components that make up a system, we call them balance of system costs, a lot of those haven't come down very much. You know, your mounting frames, your transportation costs, your installation costs, the wiring, all your electronics to interface your photovoltaics to the grid, you know, your inverters, charge controllers, monitoring systems, paying for the land. A lot of these other costs have not been coming down anything like at the same rate as the photovoltaic module. So the photovoltaic modules now are quite a cheap part of putting in a photovoltaic system, typically only 20%. And so we have this situation now where in the US, for example, 80% of the jobs associated with putting in a photovoltaic system, 80% of the jobs are actually downstream. And what we mean by that is after you've made the photovoltaic module, whatever happens after that we call downstream. 80% of the jobs are there. And so by the Chinese contributing so wonderfully to the growth and maturing of this industry and making low-cost product available, what they've also done is given the opportunity to countries like Australia to import now relatively cheap modules, but we create a whole huge industry here, create a lot of jobs in the downstream areas that employ a lot of Australians. And so it's a very good thing for Australia, the way this has evolved, because it's not actually costing Australia much money to buy those modules. And even those modules that are now quite cheap, some of those companies are paying royalties anyway to Australia to get access to the technology that they're using in their manufacturing. So there's a lot of good news for Australia in all of this and for other countries. Okay, so if we start looking then at the breakdown of what's happened to help bring the cost of the modules down, this is the cost of the module just for the last 3 years I'm looking at now, just from 2010 up to 2013. So the module cost is shown in the top line, and you can see how drastically it continues to come down just in the last 3 years. So it's gone from, you know, $1.80 a watt down to something like about under 70 cents a watt here. So it's come down by a factor of 3 just in that 3-year period there. But what I do want to draw your attention to is the fact that the encapsulation costs for making a solar module have also become quite distorted now. Right? The solar cell used to be the dominant cost of making a module. Okay? In fact, even just in 2010, the blue represents the cost of making a solar cell, and then you pay a little bit extra to encapsulate the solar cell to make a module. The encapsulation is very important because that's what determines the durability and life expectancy of your photovoltaic module. I mentioned before that a solar cell will basically last forever, but only provided you protect it properly from the environment. And that includes cushioning it nicely with some rubbery stuff so it doesn't get mechanical shock to snap it, because solar cells are a bit brittle, but it also means stopping the moisture get to your metal contacts to corrode them. So the encapsulation is very important, and it never used to cost a lot of money to encapsulate a module. In fact, if you look at this time in October 2010, the encapsulation costs weren't very great. But when you look at those two curves, they've both come down, but the actual encapsulation cost here, which is the difference between this one and the solar cell cost, has not really changed by very much. So the encapsulation costs are not coming down to the point where now, in 2013, we pay this much for the solar cell, we then pay double the price for the module. So we're paying just as much money to encapsulate the solar cell as to actually make the solar cell. Okay, that's just the reality of it. And so the industry now needs to really figure out how it's going to bring down these encapsulation costs, but do so in a way that doesn't compromise on the quality of the product. Because the industry's got itself into a bit of an awkward position that with the oversupply in recent years, and the prices falling probably more than they should have, some companies were being sent into bankruptcy. Other companies, to avoid bankruptcy, started to compromise on the quality of their product. And the easiest thing to compromise on was this encapsulation costs, just to package the solar cells using cheaper products, ones that don't cost as much. And so consequently, they would still make a solar module that would perform the same on day one, but they're not going to survive the 25-year warranty period that's being offered on them. Isn't it amazing? 25-year warranty. How many products are going to survive outdoors and exposed to the rain, hail and sunshine and survive 25 years? Not many, but photovoltaic modules have proven that they do. You know, we started manufacturing here in Australia back in 1981, Australia's first solar cell production line. We know because there was people from the university here that set up that production line. We made modules back then that are working as well today as the day they were made. Basically no visible deterioration and no electrical deterioration. So it certainly is possible to make modules that will basically last forever. The worry at the moment is that there's a lot of modules on the market where manufacturers, to stay in business, have started to use inferior encapsulation. And this is where you have to be very careful as a consumer. If you stick with the biggest companies, the ones that have the good reputations, they have to protect their reputation. They cannot afford to have dodgy product on the market. So, you know, if you look at those companies listed, the Chinese companies in the top 5 manufacturers, they're all big companies, they're all good companies, they have good international reputations. I don't believe any of them will sacrifice their quality to be able to sell cheap, inferior quality product. So I think you're safe to stay with them. But it's an important phase that the industry is going through at the moment. There's a lot of dodgy product on the market. Okay, so when we look at the whole relationship between price and market size, it's not too surprising that there's a very clear relationship. It's the same in most industries. When you're making a product, the cheaper you make that product, the more people want to buy it. That happens in most industries, and photovoltaics is the same. And so we get what's called a learning curve that defines that relationship. So that straight line there represents the learning curve that basically shows the relationship between the market size and the cost of the photovoltaic module. And that's talking about the cumulative shipment of modules. Now, over the last 30 years, you can see that all the dots are pretty much on that line. And so it's pretty well understood that if you can bring your cost down a certain amount, what's going to be the corresponding market size that will correspond to? You know, that's pretty well understood. But we did go through this turmoil just in the last few years that I mentioned. We went through this massive demand here where prices went up. Okay, that corresponded to those overly generous feed-in tariffs that I talked about that caused an artificial increase in demand. And you can see the consequence of it. The demand was so great, prices for modules actually went up during that period of time, even though the market was expanding. And so it went through that part of it. And then we've gone to the oversupply part of it, where prices have actually fallen more than they should have. And so down, 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 it came to the present point in time where we're now functioning well below the learning curve. Now, one way you can look upon this is that for the price that modules are at the moment, this is what the market size is, but over here, and this is logarithmic, right? Over here is where the market should be to correspond to that cost. In other words, it should be 3 times the size that it is. 3 times, triple the size that it is. Now that's quite an extraordinary thing to think about it. So why aren't we there? Well, the reason is that the prices have actually fallen too quickly for consumers to respond to. Okay, at this price that the modules are currently selling for, the market should be much bigger, and it will become much bigger. What's slowing that growth is the fact that, you know, if you're wanting to put in a project of PV in response to the lower prices, you have to first of all plan your project. You then have to try and organise your finance. Okay, organising the finance can be quite tricky, particularly since the world financial crisis. Once you've got your finance organised, then you've got to start applying for council approvals and permitting and all these sorts of stuff. Once you've done all of that, then you start getting quotes for prices, you buy your product, then you have to go through all the installation of it, and it's going to easily be 12 months before all that happens. So there is a time delay. You bring the prices down, there's going to be a time delay before the market is able to respond to that. And that's the stage we're at the moment. Prices have fallen so fast, the market is still trying to respond to that. So there's very good news for the manufacturers. There's very good news for those going to go into the industry like yourselves as students, because this industry is going to go through some massive growth in the coming years as it responds to the very low prices that photovoltaics are at the moment. So a lot of good news coming up. Okay, and the good news is that the price will continue to fall. Okay, maybe the prices are a little bit lower than they should be just now. Maybe they should be 10% higher. But the good news is these are predictions from the experts, and they're predicting that over the next 10 years, prices are going to halve again. Okay, so in most countries, photovoltaics is already cheaper than fossil fuel generated electricity. The prices are predicted to come down by another factor of 2 for a range of reasons that I've listed here. And that will continue over the next 10 years, quite independent of government subsidies. Okay, now I mentioned about the concerns with quality. Now, everybody has to be concerned about that. The manufacturers that are producing the good quality product, they have to be concerned, because if their competitors are making dodgy product, that creates 2 problems. One problem is that their competitors are then producing cheaper product that they have to compete with, which is a bit unfair. The other is that all the dodgy products start damaging the reputation of photovoltaics in the marketplace. And so consumers like you and I become nervous about buying product. And so there's been all sorts of studies done looking at this falling quality that's just happened in the last couple of years. And so here's just a bit of a breakdown of the sorts of problems that have been occurring. And it's been identified here that some of the compromises in quality that manufacturers are making that they shouldn't be is things like the quality of the backing sheet. So when you have a solar module, you have a solar cell, you enshroud it in this rubbery stuff to protect it against mechanical shocks and the like. Then you put glass over the front, because glass obviously allows the light to go through but provides very good mechanical protection. And on the back, there's a kind of membrane layer that has to stop any moisture coming in the back to get to the metal contacts. And then you have a junction box on the back where the electrical leads come out to. And so there's been compromises made in the quality of the backing sheets. The EVA, which stands for ethyl vinyl acetate, that's that rubbery stuff. It's a polymer that enshrouds the solar cell to protect it against mechanical shocks and the like. So you can get very cheap and nasty EVA as well. And it looks okay when you put it out in the field on day 1, but if it's poor quality, it's likely to degrade quickly and go discolour, start blocking some of the light, and even turn to acetic acid. So nasty things can happen if the wrong product is used. And unfortunately, when you look at a solar module, you have no way of knowing what quality of EVA has been used. And that's why the industry as a whole is very, very concerned about this whole quality issue. You know, the United States have had some huge new initiatives just to set up researchers with good funding to better analyse what's happening in the industry with regard to quality of products. And so there's a lot of effort being put in around the world to help consumers like you and I figure out which are the good quality products and which are the dodgy ones, because it's hard for us to tell. Okay, again, I remind you at this point, leading companies that already have a very good reputation, they can't afford to damage that reputation. Because there's another very important issue here that's been one of the trends in recent years, and it's called bankability. And what bankability refers to is the fact that the big banks around the world recognise that they have to provide huge levels of finance for consumers and people putting in PV projects on a large scale, that a lot of finance is needed. And the banks want to make sure that they're only going to lend money on a system that's going to be a good quality and is going to survive for the 20 years that it's supposed to survive for. And so the banks have actually taken their own initiative to start evaluating the quality of people's products, which is very interesting, isn't it? And so they make a short list of companies where they are impressed with the quality of the product, and they conclude that that is bankable. And what that means is that if they've endorsed a particular company's product as being bankable, it means that a consumer knows that if they buy that product, they can go to that bank and that bank will be willing to lend money on you putting in a system that uses those photovoltaic modules. That's what it means by bankability. If you try and buy the cheaper modules that are inferior product, the bank will probably not lend you the money. So if you've got the money yourself, no problem. But if you want to borrow it from the banks are tending to only lend on the bankable product. And that's what the concept of bankability is all about. But it also emphasises why this bit about the reputation and the value of the reputation for the leading manufacturers is such an important thing in this particular industry. Okay, now this is some testing done by one of the very good manufacturers, and that's SunPower. SunPower, they don't make a cheap product, they don't claim to make a cheap product, they probably never will make a cheap product, but they make a very good quality product. So people know that if they buy a SunPower module, it'll be high in efficiency and it will be good in quality and it will survive well. And if you do have a problem with your product, they will be very good at replacing your product or fixing the problem. So very reputable. And they have done their own testing, obviously on their own product, but they took a selection of a whole lot of Chinese modules, or modules from across Asia actually. I don't think they took any of the modules from any of the big manufacturers, because if they had, they would have found that those modules would have survived just as well as their own. So I think they've probably hand-picked the modules that they tested, but it does show how dodgy some of the products on the market are at the moment. So here are a range of modules from different companies. This is a thermal cycling test. So you just take a module and you keep thermally cycling it and you look for degradation. And if the cells, as I mentioned, aren't properly protected mechanically by the EVA, then all sorts of things can happen with this thermal cycling. You get thermal expansion mismatches, you get interconnect wires snapping, solar cells breaking because of the stress they're under. And so you can see the degradation. This bloke here only lasted 500 cycles. Right? You're typically going to get a thermal cycle every day, aren't you? And in some locations there'll be quite severe thermal cycles, other locations not so severe. But 500 cycles, that's, you know, less than 2 years worth of cycles. And this one's already died. And all these others are degrading as well. The SunPower module, however, as expected, no change. Then they do this damp heat testing. It's another type of test that is a good indicator as to how well modules are likely to survive into the future. And it's a fairly severe test. They're testing the module at elevated temperature in very high humidity and looking for, you know, problems that come as a result of that. And so it's called damp heat testing. And again, most of these modules degrading quite badly, much earlier than they should be. The SunPower one continues to perform well. And there's a lot of modules made by the reputable manufacturers that will all perform well like that. But you can see there's a lot of dodgy ones that you have to be careful of. Okay, so let's look at the implications of all of this on the trends in applications, the trends in the use of photovoltaic product. And so there's 3 areas you can break down the applications into. One area is where you use solar cells in huge centralised power stations. Okay, you might find an area in the desert and you might put hundreds of megawatts, even gigawatts of solar panels all there together, generating the electricity, and then you use the distribution network to take it to whatever cities you want to take it to. The second one is developing countries. These are standalone type systems where you're not connected to the grid at all. This used to be the dominant application in photovoltaics back 20, 30 years ago, because even when solar cells were 1,000 times or 100 times the present price, there were still a lot of applications around the world where it was still the best energy source. You know, mountaintops, marine navigational aids, remote areas in deserts. There's a lot of applications that still fitted that scenario. However, as the price came down, the dominant markets became these ones, grid-connected ones, where people could afford to stick the solar panels on their own roofs, feed the electricity into the grid. And so that now is by far the dominant market for photovoltaics. However, in the future, it's going to go full circle. We're going to get to the stage where as the price keeps coming down, eventually it will become cheap enough for the product to be able to be used in wide scale in developing countries. And there's a lot of us in this industry that see that as the ultimate goal for where we want to see photovoltaics get to to be able to provide energy for the 2 billion people at the moment around the world that don't actually have access to electricity at the moment. And this is the perfect technology to do it, provided you can bring down the costs efficiently. And we are very rapidly getting towards that. And so we are going to see massive growth in standalone types of systems because they don't have the electricity grids, too expensive to even put in. And so you need to have little tiny huts, little tiny households with these little tiny PV systems, which are standalone systems. A little bit of battery storage, solar panels, charge controller, very simple little systems that can provide for their basic needs. Okay, so they're the three areas. Let's just look in a little bit more detail at the three. So the rooftop systems. We're actually going to see the rooftop systems evolving. It is by far the biggest application for photovoltaics at the moment. The reason it needs to evolve is because we are getting such high levels of installation of photovoltaics in some countries now that it's starting to contribute a significant amount to those countries' electricity generation, such as Germany. There's some days in Germany now where approaching 50% of their electricity is actually being generated by photovoltaics. Now that creates a certain amount of instability because just think about it, big clouds suddenly come across and suddenly the sun's not there and suddenly you no longer have 50% of your power. They have to know how to manage that. There needs to either be some generating sources that can be very quickly started up, such as hydroelectric's very good for that, or there needs to be some energy storage so that the energy storage can act like huge capacitors to filter out spikes that might occur in supply and demand of the electricity. And so the Europeans, ahead of everyone else in the world, are seeing the need to have some energy storage within the systems inside houses. And so the Europeans are actually starting to offer subsidies now for people to evolve their system design away from just being photovoltaics to then include some energy storage as well. And so there are new subsidies to encourage that. And so this is the type of thing that a system will look like in the future, a lot of systems. This is a sun power system that's under development at the moment that they will be starting to sell in 2015. And what it basically has is it still has the solar panels, but it now has some energy storage through batteries. It has a controller, an energy management system that's going to control the way in which the household uses the electricity, uses the stored energy, feeds it when there's a surplus onto the electricity grid. In other words, an intelligent controller that can make sure that the energy of the household is managed effectively. And so that's how we'll see it evolving. Now there's other companies doing the same thing. Suntech actually launched at Intersolar this year their equivalent version of that. So that's something that they are currently now selling on the market. And there's quite a few other companies that recognise this is an important market area going into the future and are developing these types of systems. Now there's two things driving this. One I mentioned was the subsidies. There's another very important one, and that is this time of day rate variations. I don't know if you're aware of how much you're paying for electricity at different times of the day. Some people are still on the old type of system where it's just a uniform rate. You're probably lucky if you are. Those that are on time of day tariffs are paying incredibly different prices for their electricity at different times of the day. So, for example, my system, I'm paying 57 cents a kilowatt hour from 2 till 8 p.m. each day. Now to me that is absurd, that is ridiculous, it's actually unacceptable. So what choice do I have? Not a lot, because I still need electricity during those hours. But I do have a choice internally within my house to try and minimise my consumption during those hours. And so that's what I do. I have the choice to do that, that's my response. And a lot of consumers do the same. You use the electricity at the times when it's cheaper. So everyone should be moving in that direction. And that's a good thing. Okay, in the times when there's peak demand, it is good that we have to pay more for the electricity because that forces us to change our habits. And that's an important part of this whole evolution of the energy industry and the electricity industry. And it's an important part of using photovoltaics within that context. So we have the situation, therefore, some very high tariffs at certain times of the day in some countries, And Australia is probably as extreme as anybody. But it's an issue in a lot of countries. And so one way of dealing with it is to just not use electricity during those hours. That's fine. Another way is to start using these types of systems where you have your own energy storage. And so what your intelligent system will say is, oh, it's now 2 o'clock in the afternoon, suddenly I'm going to be charged 57 cents a kilowatt hour for that electricity, so I don't want to use any of that. Instead, what I will do is use it from my batteries. I now have batteries, I have electricity stored from this morning or from yesterday, stored from when the electricity was cheaper. And so I start using it out of the batteries, and then when the electricity drops down to a cheaper price, I go back to using the cheaper priced electricity, and then all the surplus electricity my solar panels are generating gets stored in the batteries, ready for the next time when the electricity is expensive. So it's a very sensible way to head. And it actually forms a very important function for our grids. It's equivalent to having energy storage for the grid. Because what you can see that it's doing is it's ironing out or smoothing out the peaks in demand for consumers that are using the electricity from the grid. And by smoothing out the demand curve, that solves a lot of the problems that the electricity suppliers face in terms of trying to provide electricity for consumers like us. Because a lot of what happens in designing our whole electricity network, when it's fossil fuel generated electricity and you've got coal-fired power stations and distribution networks, everything has to be scaled to supply those peaks in demand. And then a lot of the rest of the time, a lot of it's not that necessary. And so having a bit of energy storage in our systems, like what we're going to evolve to, will help at least reduce a lot of those types of problems. Okay, then we get to the central power stations. This is where we're dealing with utility scale use of photovoltaics. I actually don't like this as an application for photovoltaics. It's one that's taking off in the US. Again, I think it's a bit artificial because it's not using photovoltaics in the way that photovoltaics are most valuable. Photovoltaics are great because you can use them in any location. You can use them at the point of use for where you need the electricity. And to generate all your electricity in some remote location by photovoltaics might sound very appealing if you've got a desert and you're not using the land for anything else. But you then have to distribute that electricity. And the distribution costs can be massive. A lot of our most recent electricity price increases in New South Wales haven't had anything to do with photovoltaics, haven't had anything to do with the cost of generating the electricity. It's all been to do with the distribution network and upgrading it to cope with the peaks of demand on the hot days when everyone turns their air conditioners on. Right? So the distribution of electricity is a big cost. And so I don't particularly like seeing huge centralised power stations like this, where you might generate the electricity very cheaply by photovoltaics, but you then have to often transport it long distances to get it out of the desert, to get it to where the towns are or the cities are that want to use the electricity. Anyway, it's happening at the moment, but it's only happening because there are tax credits and subsidies being offered. So again, it's a bit of an artificial environment. Okay, and then we get to the standalone systems that I mentioned briefly before. This is where a lot of future application for photovoltaics will be as standalone systems in developing countries. Little tiny systems where you probably just have one solar panel per house that provides a small amount of electricity for educational purposes, for lighting at night, maybe for vaccine refrigerators, just for key services and key things to do with quality of life. This is what I was talking about in terms of equality of energy consumption throughout the world. Here's the world average here. Per person, this is how much energy we consume as a world as a whole. If you're in the US, you're consuming 10 times that amount up here. If you're in Australia, we're consuming 5 times that amount. If you're in a developing country such as, well, China's still well below that, but China's rapidly increasing because of the development taking place there. There's a lot of other developing countries that are well below that. So in the future, this average has to come up very substantially because those of us that are up here, we don't want to be brought down to here. Probably here's a sustainable and useful level, because this is where a lot of the European countries and the like are at, and that represents a good quality of life. And all the countries up here need to become more energy efficient. They need to listen to Alistair Sproul. They need to turn their lights off. They need to, you know, not waste a lot of their energy. They need double glazed glass. They need on their windows. They need all sorts of things. They need to listen to Alistair. So this is where probably things should stabilise for the world as a whole. And so this here probably needs to be brought up to something like this. That represents a fourfold increase in the energy needs of our world over the next 100 years. And when you look at the energy requirements for the world, this is a European study that was done, it shows that fourfold increase. So here we are at the present with the level here 400. This is the energy consumption for primary energy use. And this 400 goes up to 1600 by the end of the century. Where is that energy going to come from? I've already briefly talked about that. Photovoltaics is becoming more and more widely recognised as being the most viable energy source to provide most of that energy. And that's shown by the yellow areas here. So you can see that for the sake of this world, photovoltaics has to be as successful as what the experts think it will be, and eventually generate a large majority of the world's energy requirements. And so for those of you who are studying photovoltaic engineering, there should be a huge future for you all. Okay, now there's a team of experts from all around the world. Actually, I'm going to get onto the technology side of things now. So maybe it's a good time just to give you all a 5-minute break. So have a 5-minute break and then we'll resume and look at what's happening with trends in technology and manufacturing.